Hello and welcome to our third virtual event. I'm Lisa Hollins, Director of Innovation at NHSX, and I'll be stewarding you through the event this afternoon. So we hold these events every 8 weeks to keep in touch with you and update on the areas of work within NHSX. And we also hold them to hear back from you, and you have the chance to ask questions and have feedback from you at this event. So it's been a difficult year for all of us, and through any difficult time we see great examples of collaboration, invention, new ways of working, new relationships. And over the last 6 months we have seen new models of delivering healthcare, and we thank you for the support that you've given us at NHSX and given to the health and care services in England. Within our frontline services, we've been under pressure. Within the first wave of the pandemic, we saw huge admissions to hospital, and within this second wave we've seen the NHS continue with elective surgery, with outpatient work, as well as treating coronavirus patients. So it will be a really busy winter as the NHS tries to do all of those things, and we'll be delighted to welcome you all to this event, and we're delighted to welcome the start of the rollout of the vaccination programme, which you will have seen went live today, and we thank all of our colleagues in hospitals who started rolling out the first vaccinations across England. We've got a fantastic agenda today, and we'll just show the slide of the agenda. We'll hear from Matthew Gould and David Howie from NHSX, who many of you know, and I'll introduce David Probert, the Chief Executive of Moorfields, who has been pioneering the adoption of technology within his own organisation. We'll then hear from Geraint Lewis and Hadja Evans, who will outline the digital transformation of screening, and Dominic Cushnan will describe the imaging database that he's developing to support AI and analytics across NHS in England. So we'll have time for questions, and we'll break for our sessions at 5:15, where we'll hear back from you on topics that we've discussed today. So that's the time we'd like to get into some more of the detail with you, and we would really welcome hearing your feedback. So firstly, we promised that we'd start sharing some of the feedback that you've given us today. So many of you responded to us, our temperature check poll, which we had live this morning. So I'll take you through 3 slides that gives you some feedback from that for the next 10 minutes or so. And for this temperature check, we've had it live today, but we're actually going to leave it live for the next week, so people have a chance to consider what feedback they'd like to give to us, and we'll summarise this in a document. And what we do with this type of feedback is we use it to inform our programme of work for the next year. And many of you will have read Listening to Innovators, which we published about 14 months ago, and that was the feedback that you gave us about 18 months ago. So that informed all of our projects this year, and you've heard from procurement, the tech standards, all of those things that were really important to you, and we've tried to reflect those back. So it has been a really unusual year, and we were interested in how COVID's affected your approach to digital delivery, and lots of feedback from colleagues. So you talked about Zoom fatigue. I'm sure we've all experienced that. You talked about the concerns around digital inequalities, and we are collating our work at NHSX. It's something that we want to do further work on also, and also decisions about non-COVID areas, so perhaps contracts or pieces of work that you're trying to do that's not specifically related to COVID, but you're keen to progress those also. So that's really useful feedback for us. And then the next question, we have a slide summarising your responses. So just looking at how you've worked with NHSX, and thank you to colleagues, you've been really honest about some of the benefits and some areas that you'd like us to improve. So we've been trying to work hard on support and signposting, and providing some links into the NHS with our colleagues at HSNs, and organisations across the NHS. And then there were some concerns raised from colleagues about how procurement happens and how fair that is. And we've had some of those comments before. So what we will do before the end of the session today is make sure you're aware of all the procurement frameworks that are coming up. We'll summarise those, and I'll do that just before the end of the session, so you know exactly some of the areas that we're procuring over the next few months. This will be some good questions to quiz our commercial director, David Howie, we're going to hear from a little bit later. So we'll hear a bit more from David, who's really helping us getting a robust procurement process at NHSX. And then the next slide looks at the things that you would like us to work on over the next 12 months. And again, lots of really great feedback here. There is always lots of feedback on clear standards and guidelines, and you've been working really hard with us on the tech standards, and we'll hear a bit more of those with Rod in the breakout session. So we have been really appreciative of your work on the tech standards, all the feedback you've given to us, and the consultations that we've done together over the last 6 months. It's a really important area, and it will form the basis of how we can link systems together, but also make sure we're really data driven within the NHS. So thank you for all of your contributions. This is a piece of work that we'll know we've got more to do, and Rod will update you later. We had more comments on supporting organisations to consider the longer term business model, how best to link with NHS services, and we're happy to help people think through those and let them know of the financial models we use within the NHS and areas of importance and areas that will be coming up. And then the final comment on was making sure that we treat innovators as business partners, and that we don't patronise them. So thank you for giving that feedback. I think that's really important, and we'll make sure we build relationships and partnerships with people, and really fine-tune our work to the areas that are important to innovators. So thank you for all of those areas. We'll come back to some more feedback as we go through the agenda, and we have two times for questions, so please do remember to post your questions. We have people on standby here to jotting those down, and we'll start asking those to our panel members. But without much further ado, I'd like to introduce the first two people who we're going to hear from today. I'm going to introduce Matthew Gould, who many of you know. He's has been a leading light at the Foreign Office. He's been the ambassador to Israel and Director General at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and the government's Director for Cyber Security. And he is now our Chief Executive at NHSX, so we'll be delighted to hear from him. And I'll also have the opportunity to introduce another colleague, which many of you may not know, but we're thrilled to have him at NHSX. He's our Commercial Director. We've stolen David Howie, as he was Commercial Director at the Home Office, previously worked for Barclays, worked in consultancy and has a really broad career. Now he's supporting us to build the advice and expertise in commercial practice at NHSX. So I'll introduce Matthew and David, and we'll be going to Matthew first.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So I will be relatively quick because I think I will be less interesting to the people on the call than David, who's doing some brilliant work, and I'm very keen everyone hears about what he's up to. But let me just give a quick scan of where we've been since we last gathered. I mean, obviously, a lot of the team have been working very hard on the underpinning technology for the vaccination programme, and the proof of that is starting to be shown as of this morning, working very hard with colleagues in NHS Digital and beyond. We're also continuing to work on some of the big projects that I mentioned last time in September. So particularly, it's just worth repeating, we've got our What Good Looks Like project to set out clear criteria for systems and providers across health and care for what they should be doing in digital and digital transformation. And we've got our Who Pays for What exercise, which as the name suggests, is intended to provide clarity around what systems and providers should be paying for themselves and what they can look to the centre to fund. So we get rid of any accidental disincentive to invest by having an unpredictability of funding. So that's really been the backdrop. But we've also made, I think, quite exciting progress in a number of areas. And to take our three headings of digitise, connect and transform, I mean, digitise first, we've been gearing up for a second cohort of digital aspirants. So this is the successor programme to the Global Digital Exemplar programme. We had the first set last year, and they've been making some quite exciting progress in raising their digital maturity with our help. We'll have a second cohort this year, and I'm very keen that we have a particular push around mental health trusts and community trusts. And so on that, watch this space. Second area is Connect, where NHS England have made very clear, the letter from Simon Stevens and Amanda Pritchard to the service on phase 3 made very clear that we expect each of the 42 local systems to have in place a shared care record or be part of a shared care record. The recent guidance published by NHS England to the system on ICSs has digital and data absolutely woven through it and made clear that a sort of core part of being a system effectively involves making use of data and making use of digital to transform. And we are, again, gearing up our efforts to support the 42 systems, putting in place a shared care record, making sure they have in place at least a minimal shared care record capacity by this time next year, working out what support, what funding, what guidance, what standards we need in place. And at the same time, we're tackling the problem of data sharing from the other end, which is giving staff at the front line in health and care confidence to share. So we set up a information governance portal, which is now live, which builds on the one-pager we produced at the start of the pandemic, which gave some incredibly simple, empowering advice to frontline staff on when patient data could be shared. And it's tried to take that simplicity and unity of advice and apply it to lots of different situations. So staff across the system, public members of the public, IG professionals can go to the portal and we can facilitate confident data sharing that way. And then also in this space, we've launched our Centre for Improving Data Collaborations. And this, I hope, will give confidence to systems and trusts right across the front line that they can make use of their data safely and to the benefit of the NHS, and giving them advice, commercial advice, legal advice to make sure that they do so in the right way and with confidence. So that's on the Connect side. And then on the Transform side, we published a set, and Lisa and her team have been key to this, but it's very much been a collaboration between us, the Performance and Improvement Directorate of NHS England, and then Steve Powis, the National Medical Director, and his team. We published a set of digital playbooks, giving really user-friendly, easy-to-use advice on reimagining care pathways and making use of digital technology as you do so. The first four were in cardio, musculoskeletal, respiratory, and eye care. I think it's brilliant that after David Howie and I, we have David Probert from Moorfields speaking, because he's been absolutely key to this. And I mean, the brilliant thing from my point of view is the level of enthusiasm, not just from the digital side, but the digital side together with the clinical side, together with the Royal Colleges. There's a load of momentum, I think, behind this push to make use of digital technology in reimagining care pathways. X, we're making a particular push around rolling out remote monitoring, particularly because it has obvious utility as we're in the second wave and go into winter. And we've tried to make it as straightforward as possible for the system to buy remote monitoring technologies by creating a procurement framework, which I know many of the people on the call are actually on, which lets people buy those technologies instead of spending 6 months and doing it on the basis of not having necessarily much knowledge around standards and compliance, being able to do it in just a few weeks, knowing that everything on the framework is already compliant and we've done that heavy lifting for them. And I think that talk about procurement frameworks is a good moment for me to pass over to David Howie, who can tell us around what he's been doing to make sure the NHS can buy tech smarter and the health tech sector can sell into the NHS easier.
Thank you, Matthew. So I'm going to hand it straight over to David now, and as we've introduced David already, and please give us your thoughts, David, on the work that you started at NHSX.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Thanks very much, Lisa. So creating digital and tech services and products is hard enough. As innovators, you've then also got to find potential buyers and ensure they've got budget and can jump through whatever internal governance and approvals processes they need to get funding. And then you've got to navigate the whole challenge of public sector procurement processes, which I think collectively have their heart in the right place, but can be very, very frustrating, especially for SMEs and innovators, and indeed can lead to unintended consequences. So I know this is one of a series of sessions that Lisa and team have organised, and in previous sessions there's been talk about, for example, the technical standards of the services we want to buy, what the architecture needs to look like, what the data standards need to look like. What I want to do in the next few minutes is just say a few words about some of the key challenges around the procurement process and what we're doing to try and ameliorate those challenges, or at least sort of recognise them and try and make things better. There's a breakout afterwards, actually, after the next couple of sessions, and then Helen Whittle and I from NHSX and NHSE and I will be there, in which we can discuss this in more detail, and I'm actually very keen to hear your experiences. So I'm going to focus just in the next couple of minutes that I've got on a couple of specific procurement challenges, but I also recognise as, if you like, a broader, more strategic challenge of having, in some cases, dysfunctional markets that are resistant to innovation, and that we need to somehow disrupt if we're going to encourage new entrants and new participants in those markets and ultimately drive value for citizens. The first thing I want to mention, and this is a nice segue from what Matthew said, and it's the one thing that when I speak to vendors, especially innovators and SMEs, they always bring up, is that we need to do much more at the centre to signpost to innovators, to SMEs, and indeed actually to vendors across the system more widely about how best to expose your services to us. I think this is a particular problem in the healthcare sector. In the rest of government, I spent 5 years in the Home Office, the situation was a lot easier. You know, most departments would rely on pre-competed frameworks, often issued by Crown Commercial Services, for the bulk of their digital and tech procurement. And there's normally a one-to-one or a one-to-one-ish correspondence between the scope of services you'd want to procure and the framework. So, for example, if you're selling network services, you expose your services on network services framework, and there are a whole series of lots, and it's very, very clear which lots correspond to which services. If you're doing something a bit weird or unusual, then you'll run an OG process in the normal way. In healthcare, it's much more complex because, as well as Crown Commercial Services, there are a number of separate framework issuers, and indeed some trusts issue their own frameworks. So what this means is we end up with a real issue of an enormous proliferation of procurement frameworks, and it's frankly difficult to keep up to date. These change quite often, they're reissued all the time. Every time they're reissued, scopes tend to expand and swell, which means there's an overlapping of scope as well. And it's very difficult for vendors to keep up to date, especially a burden on small vendors and SMEs who often don't have the resources of the bigger vendors to keep their eye on new frameworks that come down the pike, and indeed have the resources to go through the burdensome processes of getting onto those frameworks. So one thing we need to do is make it much clearer to you as the market, not just give you clarity on the pipeline of the services we want to buy and the standards of those services, but how we want to engage with the market. The last thing we want is for vendors to go through all the hoops of getting onto a particular framework and it's the wrong one, or in fact, in some cases, a framework's not even necessary to buy those sort of services. The other thing to recognise is this process of signposting is as much internal as external. In fact, I think it's probably a greater problem internally because, again, unlike most of central government, we have this enormously fragmented set of buyers in the healthcare system, and there's a lot of inconsistency in the way those buyers buy. And I know, because I've heard this a lot from SMEs and from innovators, there's nothing more frustrating in the world than to find out, here's a wonderful procurement framework for the services we've developed. We've gone through the pain of getting onto this framework, and then a trust buys through a reseller or by some sort of direct award or through the wrong framework. So part of that signposting has to be to clarify what are a very clear category strategy within tech, and to clarify that as much internally as externally. And also, frankly, we need, I think, in many cases, to provide domain support to local buyers. We can't expect local buying teams to necessarily have the capacity or the experience to buy innovative tech, and nor, frankly, would we want every single local buyer to independently have to upskill to get that experience. So what we're trying to do is think about more central ways in which we can assure buying capabilities and services and provide that sort of support for local buyers. Some of this is actually thinking about where the appropriate buying unit is for a service. And as you know, for a lot of tech and digital services, we're trying to shift that buying unit towards the ICS rather than to the local organisations themselves, especially when we're talking about, data transfer for another shared care records and other services like that. Final point on this signposting, which is probably a bit more sensitive, is ultimately this is not just about signposting, but it's also about consolidating, I think, to quite a significant degree the frameworks that we have, and really trying to eliminate the proliferation problem. Having all these frameworks is not just confusing, but it means we end up driving competition between frameworks rather than at the level of the market in many cases. And for an organisation like NHSX that's trying to introduce not just the appropriate commercial protections, but also standards around interoperability and data flows and how we want APIs to work, it's important that we make sure that by imposing those standards, we don't inadvertently create incentives for buyers to buy through frameworks where they don't have to buy their services to the same sort of frameworks. We've established actually quite recently something called a Digital Commercial Council to try and drive this category transformation, and the aim there is to get this thing to land by recognising that we need to land this at a national and regional level. So we've got widespread participation there from teams within DHSC, NHS E&I, but also organisations like SCCL, NHS Digital, the procurement hubs, and elsewhere. I guess what I've said so far is geared probably more often than not towards pretty well-defined services, and actually the public sector procurement processes themselves are really set up for when the buyer starts from a position of being able to articulate a clear set of requirements. In healthcare, I think the potential for transformation via digital services, data services, and in particular, means that we need to have other sorts of ways in which we can access that type of transformational capability, and also other ways in which we can give buyers a broader exposure to a rapidly changing market, rather than just wait until they engage with the market for a procurement process. You know, there are mechanisms within OJU and other processes for that type of innovation, but it tends to be fairly heavy-handed. So we are starting to explore, and you've probably seen in the market, a few different mechanisms for accessing broader innovative capabilities. In fact, Helen, through HSSF, has got a lot there which is starting to drive access of innovation, and in the breakout we can certainly talk about that. So some of it is around frameworks specifically geared towards innovation. Some of it is around, I think, ways in which we can get different sets of stakeholders to work more easily with each other. So not just vendors, but people from industry, people from universities and other research organisations. And some of it is going to be probably some fairly practical stuff in doing things like, for example, offering the opportunity to buy through more dynamic purchasing systems, rather than waiting for a 2 or 3 or 5 year refresh cycle for a procurement framework. The other thing I was going to mention before I stop is, I think, and this is an issue we're working on more widely with commercial colleagues across government, in the government commercial organisation and elsewhere, which is there is a big admin burden which falls more heavily on SMEs than others. And although I think some of the changes we're doing, I mean, prompt payment is a good example, where we know that by driving prompt payment processes, we really eliminated to some degree a lot of really quite difficult and challenging cash flow problems for a lot of service providers. But those changes themselves impose a burden as well. Something, you know, an immediate example is we're moving from TED to find a tender for procurement notices from the end of this month. So yet again, people are going to have to work out how to use find a tender, they're going to have to work out how to engage with the system, and they're going to need to reset their internal processes. So instead of publishing procurement notices on TED, it's on find a tender. And I think this is something that also we're starting to do work to recognise that this does end up imposing a competitive barrier on SMEs and innovators. I think I'm out of time now, so I'm going to stop there. That's just a couple of issues. I know there are very many more impediments to engaging and selling your services. I'm more than happy and actually quite eager to chatting through that in the breakout session.
Thank you, David. That's fantastic. And there's many questions that have come in already, but we're going to pause those questions. We've got a few minutes in a second to go through those, but we're going to move straight to David Probert, and we're thrilled to have him on our as a speaker this afternoon. David, many people will know as Chief Executive of Moorfields, and he'll say a little bit more about his role there, but also he's been Chief Operating Officer for the Marsden and Director of Strategy for University College Hospital London. We've known him for a long time because he's chaired our remote care board, so he's also helping other organisations across the NHS improve technology, as well as driving forward innovation in his own organisation at Moorfields. So we're delighted to have you, David. I know you've left a board meeting to come and join us this afternoon, so we thank you for that. And I'll hand over to David, and Kieran will put your slides up.
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everybody. I thought for a minute there the fire alarm in our building has been going for the last few minutes, so I thought you may be drowned out, but hopefully it won't be returning. But it's a real honour to be able to speak to you all. And what I thought I would do, following on from Matthew and from David, it was really great to listen to that, is hopefully there'll be a consistency when I give you a view from a provider perspective. So first slide, please. So just a general view. This isn't really completely about ophthalmology. You could probably focus this brief talk on almost all specialties, but of course I'm going to focus it a little bit on ophthalmology. So a bit of an introduction to us at Moorfields. We are the oldest and probably the third largest treatment and research and teaching centre for ophthalmology in the world. About half the UK's doctors will come through us at any one time to learn the training of ophthalmology. And I think very important for this agenda, we have a very strong collaboration with UCL, the Institute of Ophthalmology, but far more broadly now across UCL, which I think is critical in delivering high-end research. Next slide, please. So a slight brief potted history. We were formed in 1804, and as you see, we've grown and developed over the course of our history to the position we find ourselves now of a network site, which I think you'll see on the next slide, if you wouldn't mind going ahead. Sorry, a network site of about 30 sites and 2 hospitals now in the Middle East and Abu Dhabi and in Dubai. So we are a big spread network with a type of network where technology becomes absolutely critical. So that is how Moorfields looks and feels and shapes. We're about a quarter of a £1 billion organisation, and we employ about 2,500 people. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour on the eye health landscape, something perhaps I didn't know before I joined Moorfields, but I think is relevant for the market. People fear losing their sight over and above everything, including cancer. It's come out as the top thing that people fear most. And unfortunately, still about 1 in 5 of us will at some time live with sight loss throughout their life. Now, hopefully that's things like cataract, which can be dealt with swiftly. But as we grow older and perhaps less well, with the prevalence of diabetes and other disease, we are seeing a large increase in glaucoma and in medical retina disease, fortunately, much of which we are able to treat, but of course none of which at this stage we're able to uniformly end. Eye examinations are critical, and it's important to know from the UK economy perspective, we lose about £16 billion because of sight loss. One of the statistics that's become very relevant both in North America and here in the UK is that it is the single biggest outpatient specialty now is ophthalmology across healthcare, and that by 2050, 4 million of us will be living with some form of sight loss. So from a market perspective, we are in a market that is growing exponentially, probably far faster than any other disease you see in healthcare. Next slide, please. Alongside that, we have this fascinating challenge, which is driving us enormously, and I think is relevant to this talk. Now, I haven't continued this graph in the world of COVID, but I can guarantee it's probably only continuing one way. But you will see that we are facing the largest sustained reduction of UK NHS spending in the last year. But we are in a period where resources are. Next. We're also in a period of time where this is the US data, where the population is fortunately getting older, but as I mentioned earlier, not necessarily growing old and growing well. So we have resources diminishing in almost every healthcare market across the world. This isn't unique to the UK. We have a population that is getting older, again, across almost every market across the world. And next slide, please. We're also facing enormous challenges. This one feels particularly live at the moment, where we are seeing our resources in terms of nursing and skill base, also the pool with which we were originally selecting skilled staff from diminishing as well. So we kind of have a catalogue of things coming at us at once in healthcare, and this could be ophthalmology, this could be cardiology or any other disease. Next slide, please. And then we have this fascinating world, which is hitting us in ophthalmology at rapid pace. And I know from my work with Lisa on the remote care board, is hitting almost every specialty. So it goes, I think, in twofolds, and I've used both these symbols for good reason. The first is that patients now want to know their results immediately. They want to be referred to using technology. They don't wish to wait for a long letter to be typed out and sent to them. They don't want the letter to go to somebody else and copied into them. They wish to be contacted directly and their GP to be copied into their letter. And very importantly, if they can get everything they want on their smartphone quickly, well, why can't they get that from healthcare? And that's a very real challenge. The second challenge is what the junior doctors refer to here as Dr. Google, which is that a large percentage of patients every day turn up having diagnosed their own condition and present the clinician with their diagnosis based from the internet. I asked them this morning what percentage of that diagnosis is normally wrong, and they said it's about 90% is inaccurate. But one thing somebody said to me this morning is that as technology gets better, as search engines get more refined, and as we find where we want to look at better rather than just scouring random sites in the US, actually that number is decreasing a little, and more people are coming with sensible questions based on the research that they've been doing at home, and so they should. Next slide, please. This picture is taken from 1938, I believe. This is a picture of Moorfields Eye Hospital, and this is a group of patients waiting to be seated, to be seen by the doctor. You can see it was back in the days when people would turn up to visit the doctor wearing a suit and tie. Now, what's interesting about this picture is in pre-COVID days, in February of this year, that would easily have been Clinic 12 in this hospital. It would have looked almost identical, barring the change in clothing. And that's really important because we fundamentally haven't changed the way we look after patients in the health service since these days. We rack people in, often at the same time, make them wait, and we rotate them around services with varying degrees of weight, and we test and manage people after we've seen them on the first occasion rather than the way we move forward. And it fundamentally has to change. The one thing this pandemic has taught us is that firstly, we can't stuff people in a room like this, so we need to plan and schedule better. But secondly, that we now have technology that enables us to see and deal with patients in an incredibly different way. So when I look at this clinic now and I think about Clinic 12, which I was down this morning, it has about an eighth of the people in there. Now that's partly because of social distancing. It's also because if you go into the cubicles of our accident emergency department today, you'll see that half of our doctors are now talking to all of their patients remotely. And they can do that in the emergency care. We have a 95% satisfaction rate from the patients that come and see us. And very importantly, we are avoiding often the old, often the vulnerable, and certainly those with eyesight conditions, traipsing across town to come and sit in that clinic when we can deal with them at home. Now, it's not without challenge, but COVID has really driven the use of technology in a very different way. Next slide, please. I think the future and where we are going in ophthalmology, and Matthew mentioned the books earlier, which I think is an important starter, is really, really important. And actually, of course, I'm going to focus on ophthalmology, but as I said earlier, diseases like diabetology have probably been leading the way in this for many, many years. We have artificial intelligence, which I'll speak about in a moment, which is revolutionizing the way that we can deliver care. And I'm sure you'll pick up on some of the screening conversation later. We have, using technology, allowed particularly non-medics now to do an awful lot of work, which we can use technology to audit to make sure that they are trained and working within the confines of their practice. We are, of course, developing robotic surgery, gene therapy, stem cell technology, which is all moving ahead. And that is really exciting. And that's the thing that Moorfields drives really its reputation of. But I'm really excited about care closer to home. I'm really excited about using virtual clinics now to make sure that we revolutionize the way that we deliver care to patients. I'll give you one good example of how that's changed here in London and something we're very proud of at Moorfields. If you're in your high street optician and the pressures in your eye are high, worryingly high, it happens to many people, by the way, so don't get too concerned. You may well be referred to us in the traditional model. You'll be referred to an ophthalmologist who will see you. That's a doctor who will measure your eyes, measure your pressure, do a number of tests, and then either carry you on for treatment or discharge you and follow you up. Now, the traditional model is that happens in 100% of cases, and patients will often wait 3 to 4 hours in an eye hospital to have a full diagnosis workup. And many people don't complain because they're very anxious, and it's 3 to 4 hours where they can be looked after. Here at Moorfields now, 100% of those referrals go into a virtual clinic where the patient will appear. We will diagnose them using technicians, not doctors, and they will be in and out of our hospital in about 20 to 30 minutes. We will then review all their diagnosis overnight with a clinician or with a grading support, and we will then let them know the next day that everything is fine. And we are discharging about 50% of all those glaucoma referrals who would previously have come in, sat in our clinics and joined that picture earlier by using technology differently. So the future is really, really exciting. Next slide, please. I think we're coming on, I know, to talk about AI earlier, but I know we have a mixture of colleagues here from industry, and I think one of the things I would say is that our relationship with Google DeepMind, which hopefully many people have heard about, but it was us partnering with one of the world's leaders to try and work out whether using imaging, and we have about 15 million images of the eye, we can use AI to determine whether or not somebody has eye disease within their eye rather than a human being. And the basic result of it, sadly, when I had to break it to the ophthalmologist, was that the AI was as good as, if not better, than our own ophthalmologists in identifying eye disease. And why is that significant? Well, the tsunami of people now that are coming forward as imaging gets better of the eye means that really we can't have human beings grading scans. And this could very much mean that when you sit in your high street opticians and they're worried about something in your eye, actually AI will tell you whether or not there is a real problem or not. And that's very real. And we're about to move forward now with Google on the next stage of that journey. And we're incredibly excited about how that goes. I've lost my slides, I think there. Right. We may have lost my final slide, so apologies. All I was going to do towards the very end is just highlight that from our perspective. Here we go. I will await modern technology to work. Next slide, please. So finally, really for me, I think I was asked by Lisa just to talk a little bit about the kind of leadership question from our perspective as a hospital, particularly the way we work with colleagues in industry, the way we work with colleagues in government. It goes without saying that I've spent my entire career trying to recruit enthusiasts in the digital world, cheerleaders, doers, and people you can stand back and just support, often by clapping in the case of some of our ophthalmologists. I have to say here at Moorfields, we're incredibly blessed. We have ophthalmologists who were previously IT programmers, who worked in industry that isn't common in medicine. So we're very, very fortunate to have people that wish to push the boundaries. I like talking digital and I like to talk up its power as an enabler. And hopefully I've given you a little flavour of that today. But I tell you what, I am absolutely no expert in it. And I've never pretended to be, and that's why you have to rely on the people around you and use real life stories to pretend it. I think it's critically important, and NHSX has really supported us in this, that we find the right resources, that we use pump priming to move forward, and that is critical because this is about capital often. And final two things, I maybe take in reverse order. The first is that I focus a lot in this hospital on the digital journey, but of course it's all about people. And we can't ever lose sight of that. And very finally, partnership. I think the one thing we've probably done badly as an NHS in our history, and I think we are doing much better now, and I thank NHSX and colleagues for helping us, is partnership with industry. It is critical. I won't tell you the amount of resource that Google put into us solving the issues with AI algorithm, and I don't just mean money, I mean brain power and full-time resource, but it was significant. And there is no way, even with the best universities in the world, we would have been able to achieve that at the speed we achieved it. So partnership for me is absolutely critical. But for those of you in industry, I think the NHS is really waking up to the value of its data, the importance of real IP and real commercial sharing. So as that partnership develops, we've really got to make sure that it's a win-win for both sides. So I hope that gives you a good flavour, and I'm very happy to take questions as the question session comes on. And of course, talk to people in and around in the future should anyone wish to talk to me about this. But thank you, Lisa and colleagues.
Thank you, David. And we've got 15 minutes of questions, so we've got lots of questions that are coming in. So brace yourself, David and Matthew. We'll just come to some questions around hospitals and a few questions on on site specifically. So we've got a question that's coming from a colleague saying some NHS customers are not sure about what they need, but they know what the question they're trying to solve, but perhaps not the solution they need. What support will be giving to them with scope? I think I'll come to David Probert and David Howie, just in terms of your experience of working with clinical teams, and David Probert and trying to work through solutions, and David Howie, just your experience of working across many different sectors and supporting people to use technology and how to work with innovators. Do you have any advice on those areas?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I mean, I feel very fortunate that I work in a research active environment. And the reason that's relevant for this is that our clinicians are very inquisitive. They like solving really difficult problems. So when it comes to technology, if I think about our EPR, for example, they know what they want the EPR to do, and they want to work with a partner to solve the problem. So I do think that research active environments are much better at this. That being said, I've been part of some howling failures in terms of IT delivery, always where I blame the supplier and always where the supplier has blamed us. So I think for me, and something we're going through at the moment, we're spending an awful long time scoping and an awful long time understanding before we really pitch to market. And when we pitch to market, we're going to be working in a much more conversational and informal way with suppliers before we really know what we want and we really know what people can deliver. And I think that slower, inquisitive but partnership model is the best model going forward.
Thank you. David Howie, any other advice and comments you'd like to give on that question?
I guess only to say that you know, the word innovation covers a whole lot of different things and means different things to different people. And, you know, regrettably, in some cases, a buyer will demand innovation when actually what they're seeking is a lower cost transaction. So I think that there's something around being honest about how you drive innovation and how you fund innovation and how you set up a commercial mechanism to incentivize that to happen. And I think there's also something around, as a buyer in certain circumstances, you don't want to have, you know, too long a screwdriver, as they say, and constrain too heavily the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So I think in many cases, although a clear specification is at the heart of a good procurement, you can also run the risk of, if you're too narrow-minded in the sort of solutions you're prepared to look at, you can just drive, you know, price competition rather than solution competition. So I think for a lot of buyers, there's a lot of thought that needs to go up front into to what level do they want to define requirements, define architecture, define the technology, and where they want to be more open to different innovative solutions.
Great, thank you, David. I've got another specific one about eye care. Is there a correlation between deterioration in eyesight and use of smartphones in children? I think that's a concerned parent asking that question. I'd quite like to know the answer to that myself. David.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll tell you two things, one of which might distress you as a parent. But the first thing is there is early sort of prediction that there is potentially a correlation. And I think if you look in the Far East at the onset of myopia in children, it's unbelievable. And there are thoughts that it's all about reading differently, but it's early stage research and also the use of the smartphone. The slightly distressing thing, Lisa, I'll leave you with is we've developed to avoid the lazy eye condition. Our pediatricians find ways to blur out things to make the eye work harder. So one of the ways we've developed that is working with Apple to phase out half of an iPad, so that a child can look at something and train their eye without realizing. So there's an awful lot of parents here at Moorfields who are encouraging their children to watch an iPad, which is where it probably isn't good in the parenting school, but it seems to work well for them.
Fantastic, thank you. And now a few more procurement questions. And there's one relating to cloud services, that the cloud services are a big stumbling block for SMEs to access to reasonably priced HSCN connectivity into AWS. This is stopping us deploying our application. Is there any further advice or any work you're doing on cloud services to David Howie?
So I think there are, in terms of a lot of stuff we're doing is around actually, I guess, making sure that although we tend to buy in the system as a lot of separate regions and localities, when we're buying from big cloud providers, we get scale benefits appropriate to us buying as part of the NHS as a whole. So there's some work we're trying to do there with central government and others, so that we get access to preferential pricing when we're buying, for example, from AWS, from Microsoft Azure and others. That's a pricing issue. There's something else also around our attempts to try and drive vendors to provide more cloud-ready solutions, because that's sort of towards the architecture we want. I think the question, though, is a bit different. It's around how we better specify our requirements to make it clear how we expect providers of services to integrate in with cloud services. So I think there's probably something a bit different there, which is probably more a tech question than a procurement question, but it may well be I've misunderstood.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I think that's been really helpful. And just a follow-up question in terms of procurement, just asking for some more details and specifics around what will be done to collate procurement opportunities. Is there a plan for a single platform to visualise opportunities across different frameworks? Is this possible?
It's possible. It's not clear that that's the chosen route we want to go, simply because we have to balance our ability to enforce and maintain and sort of drive some of the standards that we need to within NHSX, whilst giving freedom to local organisations to buy without being sort of too heavy-handed in terms of how we do this. So I think that there is something, as I mentioned, around framework consolidation. There's also something around supporting organisations to assure the product sets of vendors, so that we don't expect every single local buyer to have to go through the same process in terms of vendor evaluations over and over and over again. But we can almost on a once and done basis, we can start assuring vendor capabilities and indeed vendor progress along their development roadmaps.
Great, thank you, David. And then there's a couple of questions on who procures in the NHS and the role of CCGs, but I just thought it might be an opportunity for Matthew to say a little bit more about the changing roles of integrated care systems for the future, and how we may see things changing. So the question was around I suppose the capacity for CCGs to fulfil their roles, funding kit or software. Is this likely to change? And of course, with the upcoming changes for integrated care systems, I think that's very likely. Matthew, would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, why don't I kick off and then pass to David Howie. I wanted first of all, though, to apologise to David Probert for stealing his screen halfway through his presentation by accidentally pressing the wrong button and then in a very cowardly way just logging off rather than fessing up to it. Apologies. The point actually is a wider one, which is not just on procurement, but more generally. The system, the integrated care system, of which there are going to be 42 around England, are increasingly going to be the key geography of the NHS. And a lot more will be done at system level. Decisions will be taken, procurements will be done. I mean, it will still have an awful lot done at provider level and trust and so forth, but the system will be the key to pulling it together locally. And I think we're still in the early days of this journey, but I think the centre of gravity in decision making is going to shift. Exactly where it lands on, for example, an individual procurement decision, I guess we'll see, and it'll depend on the decision. So, for example, on issues around data, where data sharing across the system, I think, is going to be absolutely critical to having an effective system. I think you'll see decisions taken at the system level. On other things, you might see them continue to be done at the provider level. But I think this is going to be a profound change in the way decisions are made across NHS and care frontline. And it's important people to take note of the fact that I think the 42 local systems will be the backbone of the future. But David.
Yes, thanks, Matthew. And I think that's spot on, isn't it? That a lot of the work we're doing, certainly within NHSX, recognises that a lot of people's care experience will span local care, it'll span community care, mental health, primary care, secondary care, and therefore, in order to give them a joined up care experience, we need to think, especially when it comes to data, around that integrated care system rather than separately at those different levels. So in terms of the service provision and the experience we want to give citizens, that integrated system has to be at the heart of it. Procurement wise, we also recognise that, and certainly as part of the work that I'm doing with colleagues in NHS ENI and others, we are starting to promote this idea of the ICS as being the buyer of choice for a bunch of services. It's complicated because of all sorts of institutional and organisational reasons about where budgets sit and year ends and all these things, and whether contracts are coterminous or not. But that's certainly the direction of travel for those sorts of things. I think more widely, when I mentioned earlier about procurement frameworks, there's also this point about which entity is the appropriate buyer. It may well be that in some cases it sort of seems fairly clear that if we're buying a national Microsoft license, it makes sense to do that at the national level, but in other cases it's not clear where current buying decisions, if they're being made at the right level. So part of that is rethinking about that. Should be things being done locally? Should it be at the regional level? Should it be at the ICS level? Do we, for example, want to intervene nationally where we know we have markets which are not really functioning because there's a monopoly provider or a duopoly provider? So part of that will be very much what we want to start signposting to buyers about who should be the person who takes the lead on a buying activity.
Wonderful, thank you. And then the final couple of questions, which I'm going to read out both of them and then invite all the speakers to comment on. The first one is around connectivity and vulnerable people, and just reflecting that sometimes it's not everybody can gain access to the right connectivity, and how we can support vulnerable people to make sure they have access to digital solutions. It'd be fantastic to hear from everybody on what they would like to say about that issue. And then there was a final one on the vaccination programme. I thought it'd be surprising if we didn't get a question on this area. And I perhaps come to Matthew first on the vaccination area. Can you say anything about the underpinning system for the vaccination programme? And then there is a question around monitoring of side effects. I know that's more of a clinical area, but we may have to come back to colleagues on that. Of course, these continue to be ongoing tests. So at a national level, there will be monitoring of side effects. But Matthew, perhaps if I can come to you first on the vaccination system, and then anything else on connectivity for vulnerable people. Yeah,
I'm not really sure what to say on the vaccination programme, as short of giving a sort of taking everyone through the system and how it all fits together. But I think the key to it is we've intentionally got a multi-supplier approach with a number of companies and entities fulfilling different bits of the process, and then we've been working hard to make sure it all integrates and integrates safely. The next challenge, though, is to make sure we are busy creating an enormous store of data around the vaccination programme. We're doing the same around mass testing. These two enormous sets of data are, in addition to the enormous sets of data that the NHS already holds. We need to make sure that we design it at speed, because clearly this we need to stand these services up very swiftly, and are standing them up very swiftly, but we design it with the future in mind so that it can be the basis for future interoperability rather than the basis for future legacy that we end up having to work our way around because we created it without thinking about the standards that they needed to adhere to at the time. And so, for example, we will make sure that all these systems use the NHS number as the key identifier for people using the services, and working out those core principles that need to underpin all these different interventions, I think will make sure we have the best chance in the future of being able to build out from this rather than retrofit what we wished we'd done at the time. So it's not a brilliant answer to the question, but I hope it's useful nonetheless. The point around digital exclusion and making sure the services we provide hit those who don't necessarily have the connectivity or the facility with digital technology, or for whatever reason can't or won't use it, I think is a really important one. And I think I'd make 2 points. One is we need from the very start to design in inclusivity, so that we acknowledge that if, for example, we're offering a user journey that allows people to get tests for COVID through the Test and Trace app, we also have other ways of doing it so that people who don't have smartphones can still get tests. Or that we give people ways of accessing it even though they don't have a smartphone. So that needs to be built in from the start. Again, you don't want to build the service and then retrofit that. And so we've actively set up listening exercises, particularly with some of the communities that are statistically sort of least using some of the channels that we're setting up, to work out how we can make sure that the impact that the work we have is equitable. So on the one hand, I think we need to design in inclusivity. On the other hand, I think we should be unembarrassed about saying that properly used, digital technology can increase inclusivity, and that there are groups of people for whom being able to have remote appointments, being able to do things through their phone rather than in person, are positively helpful and helps them avail of services in ways they wouldn't otherwise be able to. And I think the answer is not to throw up our hands or wring our hands with despair at the impact of digital, but to make sure it's designed right, to make sure that we fill the gap between those who currently enjoy the benefits of digital technology in health and those who don't, for example, by the work we're doing at X to make sure that blood pressure monitors go to those who most need them with hypertension rather than just those who can afford them, and that we are unembarrassed about the benefits in terms of inclusivity that digital technology can bring.
Great, thank you. So I'll come to David, Howie, then we'll finish with David Probert. Your comments on those areas, please.
I was hoping you were going to do it the other way around. But look, I think I've got not much to add to Matthew's answer, which was pretty complete. It's worth saying that in the last sort of 9 or 10 months with COVID, we have been trying at a rush to really drive out a bunch of technical services and digital services, not just to the front line and to colleagues in primary and secondary care environments, but also reaching out especially to the vulnerable, the isolated, social care and elsewhere. So there's been some sort of work in that direction. We've been distributing iPads to a degree. There's clearly a lot more to do in that space, but I think as Matthew's last point made clear, this is a real opportunity to transform the sort of services and the support we can offer by some of these digital opportunities.
Wonderful. David Probert.
Thanks, Lisa. I would just acknowledge what Matthew was just saying and maybe give some quick live examples. I think we have to make products that are easy to use first and foremost, so even people like me can use them. And if I look at our video consult product that we use through a third party at the moment, it's simple for doctors to use, simple for patients to use. Secondly, we found that the people we thought would be excluded often aren't. So you can build a stereotype of excluded communities, particularly older people are far more on top of technology often in this area than younger people. And very finally, I would absolutely endorse what Matthew said about equality. I believe that technology is allowing much greater access and equal access into our services than ever happened before. There was a belief in the past that you would get to see the top people in Moorfields because you were educated, you knew how to talk your GP around, you knew how to search for the right person, and eventually you would find your way to them. Now you can literally dial into our VR service and you will find one of them. That is a different sense of access than we've ever had in this country before, and I think will revolutionise the equality agenda. My final plug, and I can't remember where I saw it, I think it was in Leeds, but I might be wrong, was they've introduced kind of digital cafes in the community for people to access healthcare, to really try and get on board on this, and it's promoted some really good work. It might not be Leeds, so apologies, but I know it was north of England. So there is some great work going on.
That's a really good note to end on, and so lots of hope for the future. But well, I think we all acknowledge that there are some barriers and hurdles that we're all trying to solve together. So I'd like to thank David Probert, David Howie, and Matthew Gould for their talks this afternoon. David, Howie, I think we're going to hear a little bit more from later in the breakout sessions. But thank you very much for your sessions today. So I'm going to move on to the next session and start of our agenda to hear a little bit more about the digital transformation of screening, and I'm delighted to introduce Geraint Lewis. Geraint started life as a public health doctor. He's also been Chief Data Officer at NHS England, and he's taken on the very large task of digital transformation of screening, and we're really delighted to have him to speak to us this afternoon. So thank you very much, Geraint.
Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. Screening is often described as one of the jewels in the crown of the NHS. So for me as a public health doctor, it really is an honour to be leading the team, improving the IT on which those screening services are delivered. If we can move to the next slide, please. So as you can see, the NHS currently screens for a dozen or so different diseases, and they're grouped into antenatal screening during pregnancy, newborn infant screening, and then there are 5 screening services for adults and young people. Between them, they reach out to 15 or so million people every year, saving an estimated 10,000 lives a year. So it really is quite an industrial scale operation. Each of those screening services needs an IT system. If we move to the next slide, you'll see that the IT system for each screening service has basically got 3 purposes. Firstly, it's to identify who in the population is eligible for screening at any moment in time. At the moment, that's mostly quite simple. So these will be rules based on age and sex. But as you'll hear later, we're increasingly going to be moving into what's called targeted screening, where we use far more variables to try and zone in on those people that are most likely to benefit from screening. The second thing that every screening service needs is an IT system to manage screening participants through their screening journey. So from the point of being identified as being eligible through to inviting them, reminding them, helping them book their appointment, and so on, all the way through for those people who have an abnormal screening result, through to linking them into diagnostic and treatment services, and also registering the disease in one of the national disease registries. And then finally, the IT system needs to track outcomes, and that's both for the individual screening participants themselves, because their screening results will affect when they next get screened, but also for the screening service as a whole to ensure that the service is working properly. Now, over the years, these different IT systems have come in for quite a bit of criticism. If we move into the next slide, please, you'll see that there have been quite a few problems with them. Although some of the screening services have quite modern IT, many of them are literally relying on 30 or 40-year-old technology, and that technology has been implicated in patients not being invited for screening when they should have been, or not being offered treatment promptly. There's also all sorts of frustrations with the system. It's not very flexible. It's very difficult to conduct randomized controlled trials. So the National Audit Office did a review, the Public Accounts Committee did a review, but this sort of came to a head this time last year when an independent review conducted by Professor Mike Richards published its recommendations. If we move to the next slide, please. So you can see that this recommendation, this programme recommended establishing a roadmap for what we were going to do about screening, and that's when NHSX decided to establish this new programme. We're going to be starting with cervical screening and breast screening, and one of our roles, coming back to the comments on the last question, is to increase what's called the uptake and the coverage of screening, but particularly for people in hard to reach groups. I also mentioned that there's going to be this drive towards what's called targeted screening. So all of those screening services you saw earlier were for a population as a whole. There's a drive now towards doing more targeted screening, most likely starting with lung cancer screening, which will only be offered to people who've got a heavy smoking history. If we move on to the next slide. So as a programme, this is our vision, this is our ambition. You can see that we're hoping to achieve a much better end-to-end experience for our screening participants, but we're also very conscious that we've got three groups of users. Firstly, there's the screening participants themselves, but secondly, there's a very large number of NHS staff involved in screening, ranging from primary care through to laboratories, radiology departments. Pretty much every nook and cranny of the NHS is involved in screening in some shape or form, and there's a huge amount that we can do to improve the working lives of staff. And then finally, there are these so-called secondary users of screening data. In other words, people who are not directly involved in screening itself, but use the data that screening generates to try and improve how screening is delivered. And that includes commissioners, people working in healthcare regulation, people working in fail-safe and quality control, and then also academic researchers. Our aim is to try and move away from the current siloed system where each of those different screening services has got its own IT, to trying to share components across the different screening services where that makes sense. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see that our philosophy as a programme is, wherever possible, to reuse existing components, and those components could be across government. So the Government Digital Service maintains a suite of components, things like gov.uk Notify, which is a system for sending out text messages and emails. So we'll try wherever possible to reuse those components. There are also components within the NHS that we are hoping to reuse. And then finally, when we have developed an IT system for one screening service, we'll try to reuse those components across the other screening services. Where that's not possible, we will then move towards repurposing. In other words, making tweaks to existing systems to try and reuse them for screening. So, for example, there may well be components to do with immunisations and vaccinations, which have got a lot in common with screening. So we would intend to repurpose those where that's possible. Where we can't do any of those, we will go out to the market, and you hear me talk a bit more in a moment about our commercial approach, and then only really as a last resort would we ever countenance building new components ourselves in-house. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see our 6 aims as a programme. Firstly, it's to inform, invite and follow up. We think technology can really help with that. Secondly, to improve the user experience for those 3 different groups of users that I mentioned. Thirdly, to increase agility. So at the moment, it can often take up to a decade between a new screening service being recommended by the UK National Screening Committee to it actually being rolled out nationwide. And we think that technology can really help speed that up. I talked a moment ago about reuse, repurpose, buy, build. Trying to reduce health inequalities is a real priority for the programme, and as you heard Matthew explain, we are passionate believers that technology is actually part of the solution. And then finally, there's this issue of interoperability, both between the different screening services, but also into the wider NHS. We need to do that if we're going to offer targeted screening. We need to draw in data. We also need to do a much better job of linking patients through into diagnostic and treatment services. And then finally, there'll be interoperability with other elements of wellness. So the NHS health check, for example, immunisations and vaccinations. So it's very exciting for me to be able to talk to, I think we've got several hundred innovators on this afternoon's call. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see that we're interested in innovation in two respects. Firstly, there will be innovations within screening. I'm sure some of you will have seen that announcement last week that the NHS is going to start trialling a new blood test that can potentially pick up lots of different types of cancer. Now, for us as a programme, that sits outside our remit. We're not there to determine what diseases get screened for or what screening tests are used or what screening thresholds, but rather it's really important that we are aware of what's coming down the track so that we can ensure that the IT systems are able to work with them and support them. What is within our gift, though, is innovation within screening tech itself. I mentioned a couple of points that we've got this idea for an interconnected technical architecture with lots of different modules, and we're really excited to understand what different innovations there might be there. So, for example, in customer relationship management, or in the wording and timing of text messages and emails and so on and so forth. Just moving on to my last couple of slides, these are really a plug for the breakout session, which I hope many of you will join us on. We're setting out here what our architectural principles are. I've touched on quite a lot of this already. Hopefully there won't be any surprises there. So moving towards internet first, public cloud first, separating out the data layer and extensive use of APIs. And then finally, the technical principles on the next slide. Again, we'll go into these in a lot more detail in the breakout session, but we conducted a request for information exercise early on in this year, just before COVID kicked off, which informed our initial marketplace analysis. We've now started engaging with the sector, so we had a joint event with Tech UK last week and a follow-up session this week. We're slowly working our way through the feedback that we've received from those sessions, which is going to inform how we work. But one of the clear bits of feedback was that people were encouraging us to use the Crown Commercial Services frameworks, which is what we'll be doing, and also to arrange frequent and regular follow-up sessions with the commercial sector. So at that point, I'll hand back to you, Lisa, but very happy to take questions in due course.
Thanks very much, Geraint, and just for our innovators, obviously an opportunity to engage with the NHS coming up very soon. So we're going to move straight into the next part of the agenda, which is from my colleague Dominic Cushnan. So Dominic has worked with us for some time across NHS England and now with us at NHSX, supporting digital innovation, and has worked over the last year with the AI lab, and he's going to present on some of the initiatives that he is developing there to support AI and advanced analytics across the NHS. I'm going to hand over to you now, Dominic.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for the introduction, and lovely to see everybody today. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you in the breakout room. Let's just start off with kind of the AI lab and its aims. I think this is quite clear to set out what we're trying to do. So we already know that the use of artificial intelligence and its applications are going to be exponentially growing, and we've seen that through some of the examples that colleagues have shared tonight. The AI lab is bringing together both government, health and social care systems, academics, policymakers and technology innovators to support the safe and ethical adoption of AI in healthcare. And that couldn't be more stressed out from the work that we started out in April, May of this year, where we have started collecting in terms of a national COVID chest imaging database with partners from the Royal College of Radiologists, the Royal Surrey NHS Foundation Trust, who's helping us with some technical architecture, the British Society of Thoracic Imaging, and faculty. We really want to ask you as colleagues, and I appreciate that we're close to time, so I'll make this quite quick. If you are developing imaging technologies and you are developing algorithms, we would love to have a conversation with you. If you have COVID-related imaging technologies that you would like to have access to training data, you can access through the NHSX website a data access request. We're also looking to independently validate some of these algorithms. I think that's quite clear. There was a lot of claims quite early on about the capabilities of AI, and making sure that we can doubly check and test what's on the tin is what we're trying to do. Next slide, please. Just for those who are not overly technical, but who are interested in this landscape, as Geraint has beautifully explained in terms of some of the screening activities, there are a number of components to how you enable innovators to develop their technologies. So you need to make sure that you provide access to good quality data. You need to be able to make sure that it's done in a safe and secure environment. You also need to provide mechanisms that allow us, and working with the regulatory bodies in the NHS AI lab, to make sure that we have mechanisms in place so that we can independently check, so that's retrospective validation, checking the efficacy of these models, and ultimately get into a place where we can support you as innovators to deploy these models back into the health and care system quickly and efficiently. And that brings us quite nicely into some of the work we want to try and discover over the next 20 weeks. Next slide, please. This is where we've got up to. So we've just started a discovery exercise. It's going to take us right up until the end of March. And we would like to invite you to come and join us. This is a typical Scrum Agile approach, where we're going to get quite messy landscape of various providers and technology solutions. What is the opportunity that we would like to build on top of that place to make sure that we're adding the correct value proposition on what our role is in helping support innovators train and develop their algorithms. We ultimately want to get to a place by March, April time to have a detailed conversation about what it is we should be potentially building out into an alpha stage that goes above and beyond the existing work that we've just done for the National COVID Chest Imaging Database. Next slide, please. Similar to Geraint, I think we are clear on our principles. We do not want to duplicate existing activities. We need to make sure that we're reusing rather than building out new solutions. We want to make sure that we provide collaboration. We want to make sure that we're also enabling innovation to deployment. This is quite critical. We want to make sure that we provide the mechanisms that enable you as innovators and entrepreneurs to come and provide solutions to us that provide benefit back to our clinicians and ultimately back to us as patients. We're spending time in 2-week sprints, and this will be specifically on the user research side of things. We will also be looking at technical, but we want to make sure that we understand what are the pain points that you might have as innovators for providing specifically solutions into the imaging pathway. Next slide, please. Just a quick slide for those of you who have not done any agile discovery activities before. We're following a traditional GDS process, and we're kind of in sprint 2 at the moment, but we're looking to conduct research over the next couple of weeks, early next year. So please do connect with us. I'll go into the next slide, please. Let's see the clock ticking. So how you can get involved with us. Please do attend our show and tells. We're doing this on a Thursday, every other Thursday at 12 o'clock. You can connect with us at imaging@nhsx.nhs.uk, and we'll put that into the chat. We'll also be reaching out to groups to have more detailed user research interviews, so we can really get into the nitty-gritty of what it is that it needs to be solved, and where are those pain points, and also where are those opportunities. We've got a number of surveys that we're trying to do, and also you won't be able to click on this link, but we would love for you to get involved in some of the kind of hunches and sprints that we're doing over that period. Next slide, please. The last comment I'll make is that it's late in the day now, but we have just closed the second round of the NHS AI Award, and we're looking forward to seeing some of your applications in that process, and we'll be looking to reopen that again in another 6 months' time. But this is ultimately about helping you as innovators produce the evidence that's required for you to come to market in the UK. Next slide, please. I will end it there. I think I just hit on time, Lisa. Did that work?
That was beautifully on time, Dominic and Geraint, so thank you very much for that. So we've got a couple of questions that we're going to ask just before we go into the breakout sessions. And the first question was on immunisation so a colleague has written in that we provide school-age immunisation solution used by the NHS. It's been difficult to try to find who to engage with, and also delayed access to the VAX ANI has been restricted our access to participate in the market. So we're engaged with the GP IT futures requirements, and we're eager to engage, but difficult to know who to link with and who is commissioning what. So Geraint, would you mind saying a few words about that?
I'm afraid I'm not responsible for IMS and VAX. I don't know if David might be able to help on the commercial aspects of IMS and VAX, but certainly if the person who made that comment thinks that their components could potentially be repurposed for use in screening, we'd be absolutely delighted to hear from them.
Any further comments, David Howie? Anything else you wanted to add? Otherwise, we can take that offline, find out who's the colleague that will help with that one, and we'll get back to that person separately. I don't think there's anything further from David. Great. Okay, thank you. So we'll take that away. Okay, so we've got a further question actually, which is quite a broad question, which is, as a startup, we've been signposted to partnerships to make sure we can enlarge our business, to get over the hurdle of being too small for most of the procurement opportunities. Can NHSX support finding appropriate partnerships rather than us trying to find our own partnerships? Do you have recommendations on who we could partner with? And that question is to David Howie. What do we usually do in those circumstances? I'm just visioning David as a bit of a matchmaker there. Okay, do you want to try once more, David? Is that okay? Just see if we can make sure you're off mute.
Yeah, so can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah, great.
It's probably best to take that one offline. It's quite a complex one, and normally we're not in the business for matchmaking, but often we're in a position where we can perhaps steer people in certain directions. Yeah.
Great. No, we can certainly give people some information, and it is really difficult, isn't it, if you want to know who are the players in a certain field, and so we're happy to give some advice offline. And then the final question that we had. So how are you dealing with the model programme of retraining and re-release? Geraint, I think this is for you in terms of the repurposing of the screening technology that you're working with. Can you say a little bit more about how it will be used, who will be trained, and how that will be rolled out in the future?
Yeah, I'm hoping I've understood the question correctly. So as you heard, there are three broad users of our service. Firstly, they're the screening participants. The aim, I think, with the technology is that you wouldn't need training for it. It needs to be so easy to use that anybody could just pick it up. And obviously there are ways of doing that by adhering to NHS Style Guide, for example, and working with, if it's going on the smartphone, that we adhere to kind of best practice. The second set of users are the screening staff. For them, because of the kind of clinical safety critical aspects of it, then there would be a dedicated training programme. We are about to go through that as a bit of a dry run with cervical screening. We're moving on to a new platform in the new year because the existing system is so outdated that we need to do that as a matter of urgency. That's not going to affect affect screening participants in any way, but we have a dedicated training programme that will take all of the different screening staff through it. In terms of secondary users of data, we're moving much more towards a self-service type model, and as we develop that technology, we'll be working and listening to all the different groups of secondary users to understand what their requirements are and then what the training will need to be on the back of it. So, for example, on Thursday, I think it is, I'm speaking to a group of researchers who work in breast cancer screening, and will very much be in listening mode during that meeting.
Thank you, Geraint. So I think that's all the questions we have time for at the moment. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers. It's been a real pleasure to have you, and thank you to people for joining us. We have 4 breakout sessions. And you've been sent the links, and the links are also in the chat. So we have procurement with David and colleagues. We have the digital screening programme with Geraint, who is going to be talking you through some of the details of that. We have AI imaging with Dominic, and we have the digital tech assessment criteria with Rod, who people know very well. So just a final thank you to Nicola Fulton, Louis Dozier, Kieran Ramadan and Ellie Munari, who have helped us set up the session today. We're really appreciative of their hard work, and we hope to see you in just a few minutes in each of those breakout rooms. Thank you once again for joining us this afternoon, and it's been a real pleasure getting your feedback. And in terms of all of the feedback you gave on our temperature check this morning, we'll be holding that questionnaire open for the next week, and feeding back more fully in the first week in January. Thank you very much for your participation this afternoon. Goodbye.